Hello, everyone. Sorry that I had to move the class. I had to cancel the class and instead recording this lecture as I explained in my email. So today we will discuss media studies, and this is actually one of my most favorite topics and mainly my research focus. And I was looking forward to actually discussions in the class with the whole class. And as luck would have it, I had to reschedule. Anyhow, we will discuss media studies with a focus on and the following questions. We will start with historical trends. I will go very briefly through this, and this discussion is actually in Hoffman's literature, and you can also check Lutz and Lutz's books as well. And I will discuss why terrorist groups use media, how do they use it, for what purposes, and if the role of media has changed over time. This also falls back to the historical trends. And in general, we will talk about the role of media in radicalization process and what other purposes that it serves for terrorist organizations. At the end of the lecture, I will also talk about the essay topics and how to address the questions, the topic of the essay for your essay number 2. So when it comes to the background and historical trends, technological advances, you all know about this. It has actually transformed reporting and the type of reporting that concerns terrorism, both in terms of how terrorist organizations use these technologies and how reports on terrorism have evolved over time. Mass communication, just very brief history of mass communication, just to get a very broad general historical perspective. You would see that radio, mass circulation newspapers, they took place in 1833 in the US, and that allowed for more timely and affordable propagation of the news. And in 1920s, the radios, for example, the first radio broadcast and reached out to civilians. 68, the birth marks the birth of the first satellite TV by the US, and 89 is marked by internet. Which was founded by a certain Berners-Lee, and the rest you all know. 2004, Facebook, 2006, Twitter, and so on and so forth. So the role of media, one of the most discussed example is the 1985 Transworld airline flight 847, which was an incident of hostage taking. It received major coverage from the media, particularly the US media. It's an important example, the first one which received, as I said, coverage, widespread coverage. This flight was hijacked by Hezbollah. It was going from Rome to Cairo when it was hijacked, and the hostages, there were those on the flight were taken hostages, the whole the hostage takers, in fact, the whole attack and the whole event was organized and strategized in the way that all the attention of the hostage taker was given to the US and US journalists in order to get coverage. even uneventful days that there wasn't much going on in terms of negotiation, or the media didn't have any access to hostages, the media focused on emotional aspects of the event and grieving of the family, or what we refer to as soft news and soft side of the stories. And the public emotions had a big role in terms of how policies were shaped, how negotiation policies were shaped, and the politicians responded to the whole negotiation events and the whole hostage taking crisis. And news organizations were, in fact, competing amongst each other for coverage of this event. As I said, the competition and the role of the media was so strong that Henry Kissinger at the time said that TV coverage of the incident has actually complicated and even undermined the government's efforts to release the hostages. So that actually influenced the whole process of negotiation and the political negotiations and discussions with the terrorists, with Hezbollah. So let me minimize this video. So terrorism and media, just give you a very brief outlook. Terrorist organizations know how to handle the media. They actually have their own media strategies. They have sophisticated media strategies, as we will see in the case of IS, for example. They're deft at manipulating the media. And they are some of them, including IS and Al-Qaeda, have graduates from media studies from even US or European universities who have joined them and formulated their media strategies. And the media in general plays a very important role in terrorist organizations. And if you remember with the definition of terrorism, we discussed that terrorism is not just about an act of terror against the victim or the individual, that modern day terrorism, an important aspect of it is to spread fear, to spread terror. And that cannot be done without media. As Hoffman highlights this, the act of terrorism and the act of attack might be totally wasted if it doesn't attract attention of the media and is not widespread in terms of the message that terrorist organizations want to send. And Jenkins pushes this argument even further in his article in 1974, stating that terrorist acts are often carefully choreographed to attract the attention of the electronic media and the international press. To the extent that Jenkins described terrorism as a theater that the terrorists and those involved in act of terrorism put out a performance in order to influence the audience and actually send their message out and reach out to the audience. In general, the relationship between media and terrorism has often been described as a symbiotic relationship. Symbiotic relationship in the sense that if you think about the example of hijacking of a plane by Hezbollah that I discussed earlier, it shows that the media relied on the stories coming from the event, and in order to increase its outreach amongst its audience. At the same time, terrorist organization Hezbollah relied on the media in order to reach out a broader audience. This was to the extent that in Al-Qaeda's history, for example, previously and before, especially before social media, Al-Qaeda would actually send videos of its own attacks, but when they were in the 80s and 90s, when they were reliant on VHS tapes, for example, they will tape it and send it to media organizations such as Al Jazeera or CNN or BBC. And then sometimes that news uh, uh, would get coverage from those traditional media sources. And now that changed over time because then policies were put in place that would prohibit the media organizations from publicizing some of those videos and or show them, in particularly the visuals. So that aspect of it, that shows that symbiotic relationship and how important media was and is for terrorist organizations. So for terrorists and also media, they have an interest both creating these stories and the coverage of stories, and also reaching out to a wide and broad audience. And as we all know, that the more violent or life-threatening a news piece is or an event is, the more coverage it might get and the more advertising revenues it might actually open up for the media. Now, that being said, we need to be critical of this symbiotic relationship. And if you're going to especially discuss it in your essays, watch out that you don't just take it as it has always been in that way. It has changed over time, and do not confine yourself to just talking about this symbiotic relationship and ignoring how else the news or coverage of the news from terrorist organizations shapes this relationship between media and terrorist organizations. Now, that being said, we move on to the next discussion. So this complex relationship, it can be positive and negative. They might reinforce each other, and they might actually, sometimes it might have, as we discussed, negative impact, negative impact if the coverage is broad and an incident is ongoing. For example, it might actually increase risks for victims and complicate the negotiations, so on and so forth. And then we go on to the next discussion, the new media. This is basically, you know it, the new media sources, social media in general, internet, so on and so forth. So when it was when at the time during 80s and 90s, when Al-Qaeda was recording its message, or any other organization, Hezbollah or the others, were recording their messages, recording their attacks, the organization was in charge and there was a central media strategy. So, and they would record it, they would publicize the video or publish a newspaper, so on and so forth. But when the mass-marketed CD-ROMs and DVDs came into the market, then that message got a lot more easy to disperse. And CD burners were easy to get. One CD could be copied into thousands and then disperse them that way. So that shift from the shift and control of media was in the hands of terrorist organizations. What does it mean? That even if traditional media sources, for example, were refusing to publicize an attack or an event, then because it was easy for Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, or Hamas to produce these very cheap DVDs and CDs, they could actually still send out their message through these means. So another concept with the new media and also traditional media that we need to consider is the notion of narrowcasting and broadcasting. So broadcasting is this notion of narrowcasting or broadcasting is relevant to the discussion of audience. Broadcasting is when a topic and a discussion is targeted towards multiple audiences, towards a very broad audience base. And narrowcasting is when the audience of a message or a video is a specific group of people or a specific organization, so on and so forth. So this new media in particularly allowed for terrorist organizations to switch back and forth or at the same time have very narrow casting strategy and target, for example, people, Muslim communities in a particular country, or individuals who come from a certain background. They could target a specific gender or children, for example. So that notion of narrowcasting and broadcasting also became a lot more important with the new media sources. So modern day trends, as you all would know, is very much reliant on internet and access to internet. This has helped overcome technical and geographical constraints, much faster speed, affordable, cheap, etc., etc. But Al-Qaeda or IS, despite the fact that it might appear that they were the pioneers in this, using internet extensively for their purposes, is not entirely accurate because there are historical examples as Zapatista National Liberation Army, which was using internet all the way back in 1990s, and they were mobilizing individuals through internet. And the content was tailored towards advertising towards the audience in order to attract the audience and to win the sympathy and empathy of the audience. So given this discussion, Bridget Nakes, one of the media studies scholars, and the book should be assigned, is listed in the recommended reading list, talks about the discussion of terrorism as e-terrorism because of the extent of electronic devices and internet being crucial and important for terrorist organizations. This refers back to discussion of terrorism in internet chat rooms and discussion boards. She discusses Offer Rahum's case, for example, as one of the first cases of social media having an influence on terrorist activities. The first Israeli teenager who was actually lured to on the internet and chat room to travel from Israel to Palestine, and then he was captured there. Social media has an important role: Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, 8chan, 4chan, so on and so forth. Another case study that Bridget Nakes also talks about, and you can explore it in detail if you're interested, is the Denver case study that social media such as Twitter was used by two sisters and their friends from Denver who were lured by IS to travel to Syria and join IS, the Islamic State, but they traveled all the way from Denver to Germany, and in Germany by then the law enforcement had been informed, and they actually interrupted their trip and didn't let them travel to Syria at the time. So, excuse me. What is the internet used for? Bridget Nakes provides discussion, which in general is rather descriptive use of internet for various purposes. So this framework is rather descriptive. It just focuses on the ways that internet is used for by terrorist organization, whether these mining for valuable information, planning and coordinating attacks, reporting and glorifying terrorist operations, radicalizing and recruiting, waging a psychological warfare, taking group rivalries public, and raising funds. So we go into each one of these, but you just need to be aware that this model by Bridget Nakes is rather descriptive. So if you're selecting it for your essay, be aware that you need to engage in much more critical discussions depending on the topic that you select. So mining for information, what does that mean? This is, if we compare, for example, one of the more studied attacks, Oklahoma City bombing in '95, to another attack that has happened in more recent times, you would see that in '95, for example, it took the the Oklahoma City attackers, terrorists, that attacked the Mora Federal Building in '95, which was the bomb exploded there. The bomb was planted by McVie and Terry Nichols. It took them months to dig out that type of information, plan the attack, and come up with a federal building that was housing multiple different government departments in the same building. So that type of information was not easy to find. And it just took them, as I mentioned, the McVie and Nichols, months and months of preparation and finding that information. How long would it take nowadays? You can imagine using the internet, it would be extremely easy to unearth such information. And computers left behind by Al-Qaeda, for example, you would see that how easy it has been by Al-Qaeda to actually also in the using the internet to collect information. The Mumbai attack, compare that, keep that in mind, in the back of your mind, and compare it with Mumbai attack in 2008. During this attack, 164 people were killed. Lashkar-e-Taiba, it's a Pakistani-based terrorist organization, was responsible for it. And they used Google Earth to basically look and navigate the geographical area in real time. And the scouting was done by a US citizen called David Headley. He collected the information, and internet was used for the initial information gathering. It was used for scouting. He collected the information and passed it on to in real time on chat websites to the organizers all the way in Pakistan. And he even ran dry runs on public transportations, in the sense that the operators, these fighters, would take the public transportation back and forth, make sure that they time the attack precisely, so on and so forth. So all of that was facilitated, apologies, by the media and by the internet. And the other concept, the other use of the internet, planning and coordination of attacks. The Mumbai attack also is showing how the whole process of planning and coordination took place. Encrypted messages were exchanged between the attackers and the organizers in the headquarters in Pakistan. The IT chief of Lashkar-e-Taiba, Zarar Shah, was in charge of the whole operation. They were using voice over internet services to connect with others, and they were at the same time, while the information was being gathered in Mumbai, India, they were connected with operators in Pakistan, in New Jersey, Australia, etc., etc. And all of that information is documented by investigators and research and policy papers. So the other purpose of the media for terrorist organizations is reporting and glorifying attacks. This has happened across a wide range of organizations, taken from far right to extreme left, and also obviously jihadi terrorist organizations. All of them report and glorify their attacks on media, and sometimes in real time. So one of the most discussed real-time examples is when Al-Shabaab attacked the Westgate Mall in Nairobi, Kenya in 2013. They were reporting in real time on Twitter. Thousands of Twitter feeds went out describing in very graphic, describing the violence in graphic terms, and also uploading images and short videos. And this was a self-reporting strategy used by the attackers, by Al-Shabaab, and during the Westgate Mall attack. And the Christchurch shooting mosque is another one in 2019 that, if you think about it, that if you don't have the background information, this is the attacker who started shooting at the Muslims gathering in the mosque in Christchurch in New Zealand, and he published his manifesto on Facebook, and also used Facebook feed to capture the attack in real time. By the time Facebook closed down that channel, it was already, the videos went up, and a lot of people had got access to those news feeds and videos. So the media is also used for radicalization and recruitment. Recruitment from person to person has often moved to screen. Graphic images are used by some of these terrorist organizations to influence their potential recruits, to influence their potential audience. For example, one of the 2005 the failed bombing plot in 2005 by Hamdi Isaac is it shows that how the attackers were influenced by DVD and images from the war in Iraq, and that the women and children who were killed in Iraq by the British and American forces were used in those videos. This is the narrative that was put forward in those DVDs. And the 2005 Boston attacker was influenced by these images and videos that were recovered by the police. This is again the Denver teens that I earlier discussed, and this is not just, as I mentioned, about the Al-Qaeda or IS, although they are using it extensively, and especially IS has been notorious in how they use internet, social media, and all types of multimedia for their purposes. But other terrorist organizations such as Nassar Baluchi of Balochistan Liberation Army, they talk about the importance of media. He describes media as a media bomb. This is the war of ideologies, and how important it is to actually launch psychological warfare. So even smaller terrorist organizations with a more local focus, regional focus, are heavily reliant on the media. And sometimes, interestingly enough, there is sometimes terrorist organizations still continue with their presence on online social media platforms. So the example I just gave you about the Balochistan Liberation Army from here, this person had his account was open on social media, on Twitter, and Twitter refused to suspend his account for a very long time, despite the fact that there was an uproar and discussion in Pakistan that he was openly encouraging for violence and calling people to take up arms and fight against the government. Nonetheless, Twitter refused. Now, that is the policy of Twitter. The policy of Facebook might be a little bit more strict. Facebook, for example, does not also allow the Taliban to have a prominent presence on Facebook accounts, but nonetheless, Twitter, they are all active on Twitter, and they are present there. And even during insurgencies, the Taliban, at the insurgency time, the Taliban had a pretty prevalence activity. Well, they were pretty active on Facebook, on Twitter. And this reminds me of a study done by Dresden on Taliban's Twitter presence and how the US, at the time, ISAF, International Security Forces in Afghanistan, they engaged in a Twitter war with the Taliban, firing at each other back and forth on Twitter. You can check that as an example if you want for your essays as well. So one of the purpose of media usage is waging psychological warfare, as I mentioned before, and internet can easily that can facilitate that. Army of God, for example, anti-abortion extremist in the US, posted at some point names of abortion providers, judges, politicians, and their families online. That created a huge concern for both the victims and also for law enforcement, that once those names are out, they can easily become targets. In 2015, hackers claimed to be working for IS, hacked in social media sites by the US Military Central Command, and took over the Facebook, Twitter sites by their ISIS propaganda. Here is a small a screenshot of how they launched this psychological warfare, and we put on these messages that we broke into your network and personal devices, and we know everything about you, and so on and so forth. I won't repeat that. You can read it. And then they also published a 52-page spreadsheet which had a list of retired Army general officers, names and addresses, and their email addresses, etc., which is extremely, you can see why this will be a huge cause for concern for security of those officers, and the US government and the Army was particularly concerned about the issue. Next one. And is ISIS a revolutionist in this regard? As I mentioned before, ISIS, other jihadi terrorist organizations had also used internet. ISIS social media approach has been widespread, and there has been an increase in its activities. It also used internet in order to launch its wireless caliphate. So despite the fact that sometimes the ISIS had no physical presence in many areas, but they had an online presence. This is also discussed by another book by Agrawal on Taliban's virtual emirate, how active the Taliban were online during their insurgency times as well. So you can check that resource as well if you're interested in the topic. So another aspect of the media terrorism relationship is publishing group rivalries online. Intergroup competitions sometimes happen online. I know you were assigned a couple of articles in previous sessions that in comparative analysis, for example, Al-Qaeda, IS competing against each other. They took this competition online. And some of my own research, I do comparative analysis of featured stories in IS Al-Qaeda propaganda. They were speaking against each other, or even when there is a gender aspect of it, that another research project that I worked on also shows that there's rivalries of the groups in terms of addressing the pool of recruitment and trying to attract them towards IS or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, etc., etc. For example, in the depiction of women in jihadi magazines, for example, we found out that TTP, Tehrik Taliban of Pakistan, specifically addresses women from South Asia to go and join TTP, and very subtly they try to take them away from ISIS without too much being too obvious and hostile towards ISIS. So these are the publicizing group rivalries is another theme that is important in media analysis. And raising funds. I mean, this has happened over time. One of the earliest websites that was launched was Azam.com. If you remember, I discussed that Abdullah Azam was, along with bin Laden, was the founding father of Al-Qaeda, and in his name, a website was published, Azam.com, that through that website, Al-Qaeda was collecting funding and raising funds for various activities. The website was published in 16 different languages. ISIS media is published in more than 30 plus languages. They use sophisticated media technologies, and they also advertise for experts on internet, experts on IT and computer scientists to join the organizations and offer help and support. So all of these 7 reasons, as I mentioned, were discussed by Bridget Nakes in Mass-Mediated Terrorism, but it gives you a very good broad overview of the relationship between terrorism and the media, both historical trends and also in terms of more specifically how the internet is used by these organizations and for what purposes. So I'll get into case studies, but before I do that, I would have to stop the video for a bit because I want to record this in 2 bits so it's easier to upload online.